Hey guys, so I am back to do another history video as I promised. If you didn't see my first one, I did a video where I talked about revisiting the revolution and some different books that will help you to explore or re-explore the American Revolution through some different lenses, like, you know, a little bit beyond the basic story that we learned in school, or, you know, Liberty's Kids, if you were a Liberty's Kids person. I've also decided to kind of equanimity some of my shirts. So I wore my Mount Vernon shirt for George in my last video, and then just so he wouldn't feel left out, because Jefferson's ego is the size of the, you know, full United States that he eventually helped create, I've got my Monticello shirt on. What I want to do today is expand the lens of the history books that I want to tell you about over the course of 250 years plus. Because yes, obviously 250 years since the signing of the Declaration, that is really, really important. But of course, the Declaration is also one moment in time. There's a lot of history that happens before that moment here in this country and in the American continent generally. And so what I wanted to think about was some books that are not just focused on the revolution, and not even just focused necessarily on 250 years of history. And I wanted to pick books that would give you like an exploration of a large span of time, but are also really, really good books that are interesting and fun to read. And that is not always things that go hand in hand, because there are some really, really informative books that are super dry. So I wanted to give you some of my favorites that will give you a bird's eye view of 250 plus years of history that are also really engaging, and will definitely teach you something that you didn't know before, because they definitely did for me. So I want to start this adventure of 250 plus years with one of the most interesting history books about the history of the Americas, right? Because again, countries to a certain extent are just lines on a map, and what we know of as the United States today was not nearly as large when it started in 1776. But there's this book called American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America by Colin Woodard. Now, I've talked about this book before. I've read 3 or 4 or 5 books by Colin Woodard because I just generally find him a really interesting cultural historian. So, hey, you might be interested in more of his books than just this one. But this book is an idea that, rather than thinking about like the history of, say, the 13 colonies, for example, or the history of the 50 states, like whatever it is, however we think about the history of these different areas that kind of make up the United States, he thinks about these 11 cultural regions that he's created, and he thinks about the history of where the people in those regions came from, you know, so where they immigrated from, for example, or, you know, what their colonial history was, you know, the Native Americans that were already there, and the different ways that these different types of people interacted with the people who were already there. And he doesn't limit it to the borders of the United States. These rival regions extend up into Canada, they extend down into Mexico, because he's not tracing countries, he's tracing like areas that have historical connections. And as someone who grew up near the Canadian border, you know, there definitely were times that I was like, I have more in common with these people who are like technically in another country than me, than other people who are in my country, because of, say, our regional similarities, our environmental similarities, the ways that our economies interacted. And of course, that was true even before the United States was the United States. American Nations is such a fascinating book that really helps us to expand past ideas of, you know, there's all these talk in the US about like between North and South, right? Or between East and West. And this is a book that again takes the entire United States plus all of the Americas and mixes it into these 11 nations, like cultural regions, that I think, as I was reading it, really, really helped to explain to me how, like, some areas, like, you know, the South or the North or the West, include these incredibly various groups of people, or like different types of ways of thinking, even just like the words that we use, right? And the different things that we'll call soda or pop, or, you know, that's a bad example, but it just helps it to put into so much better perspective the different histories, cultural histories, sociocultural histories of these various places throughout this giant, giant country of ours. I highly recommend it. It is super, super interesting as like a thought experiment to read through it and think about what happens if we reconceptualize how we think about, you know, even if you just take the United States, for example, not as states, but as these historical cultural regions. It's super fascinating. Speaking of 250 years plus, there is this incredible book titled Fantasyland: How America Went Haywire, a 500-Year History by Kurt Anderson. Now, in the title, we hear 500 years because Kurt is going to go all the way back to the beginning of what we will eventually consider the United States of America and talk about what he calls the fantasy industrial complex, and how there is this thing in the United States where we have like this really, really interesting ability to live by our own fantasies. And he starts by like the incredible idea of, you know, the religious pilgrims and people who came over in boats looking for religious freedom here, and how they just thought, okay, if I just get in a boat and I go across a gigantic sea in a very dangerous voyage, I'm going to do this because then I'm going to have religious freedom, right? I'm going to leave behind all of the problems of mostly England in this case, and I'm just going to go and I'm going to like do my own thing, right? But of course, just because you leave behind England doesn't mean you leave behind hierarchies of humans. And of course there were already people here, but like this crazy fantasy or dream that we could do this, right? And the same thing, the idea that in a world full of monarchies, that a group of regular people could just start a new country and make it a republic. Like, what a fantasy, right? That we just happen to make a reality. And so there's some foundation for some of this, but he tracks it all the way through our history, all the way through to things like Disney, and just how like there is this something in the American brain that has this way of thinking about fantasies that affects how we interact as a country and as groups of people. It's really, really fascinating. And despite the fact that he's going back to, like I said, 500 years of history, which technically Colin Woodard is too, it's really, really engaging. And I think offers us a different way to think about maybe how we think affects how we interact with other people. But also like what the historical basis is for that, and why we may think, well, duh, like I can just like have this fantasy or have this dream in a very, very uniquely American cultural way. So as someone who does research, particularly on the Revolutionary period, and often is focused on either issues of African American history or Native American history, I do want to obviously bring up that when we talk about the history of this continent, there are the people who were already here when the Pilgrims came over, and then also there have been all of these controversies in recent years about what happens if we decenter the revolution, right? What happens if we decenter the Pilgrims and the Mayflower, right? And we think about, for example, with the 1619 Project, starting and thinking about our history from a different point of view. Obviously, every history book is a narrative that has to choose a place to start. And so this idea as a thought experiment is something that we do all the time, but in some cases it's just much more complicated than others. But I have two books that I really want to bring up that are super interesting, and in one case I actually got to meet the author. So this one is The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History by Ned Blackhawk. Ned Blackhawk is a Native American academic who has written this incredible history book, and at a recent social studies conference that I went to, I got to hear him speak about the book and speak about how he did his research and his personal history and all that type of stuff. This is one of many books that is on on my list to read. It's the only one that I've read and I've really enjoyed as much as I want to like put it in this, because I've read a lot of scholarly stuff that I wouldn't necessarily make anyone else read. I put Ned Blackhawk's book here because it's one of the ones doing what I want to do, right? Cover 250 plus years of history. But I also have to tell you about one of my other favorite books. It just happens to cover a little bit less history. There's also The Fire We Carry by Rebecca Nagle. This is about specifically Native Americans and their land rights in the United States, and specifically focusing on more recent history about some really interesting Supreme Court cases that have given land rights back to Native Americans based on treaties that were signed by George Washington, but these like Supreme Court opinions were written by Neil Gorsuch, right? So it's a very interesting, it is kind of like connective history that does span your 250 plus years of history. That one just is mostly focused on more recent events plus Rebecca Nagle's family history. But if you want something that's more comprehensive, I highly recommend Rediscovery of America. If you want something that's maybe like a little bit less, but like definitely more narrative and almost personal memoirish in parts, By the Fire We Carry. Oh, super good. One of my top 5 books of last year. In the same vein, it would be impossible to do this video without talking about Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram X. Kendi. This one is a doorstop. It's huge. I listened to the whole thing on audio, but when he says definitive in that title, he means it. He has gone back and traced African American history and the experience like all throughout, again, pre 1776 through and forward, and it is extremely detailed, it is extremely scholastic, but you cannot really, as far as I've yet to read, get a better comprehensive history than that book. And it is on a bunch of best ofs for a reason. In a related vein of a book that people might not be as familiar with is Freedom's Dominion, A Saga of White Resistance to Federal Power by Jefferson Cowie. Now, this ends up being a micro-history of the town in Alabama where George Wallace is from. He of segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And it is a little bit more on the scholastic side, but I have never seen a book go through this much American history through the story of a single town in such a way before. It was so well done. Through clear and precise recitation of facts, Cowie is a really strong through thread of this, which is basically that freedom in America is often defined as the freedom to dominate others, regardless of what the federal government says. And in some cases, the federal government has supported this. And in some cases, the federal government has said, don't do that. And it's been done anyway. It's a really, really interesting, powerful book. It is a little bit more on the scholastic side, but I also think that it's a really, really important read. And again, the idea to be able to do this through one town, one county in Alabama, and still be able to span the entire history of America, really well written. Speaking of telling history through one place throughout most of American history, we'll have to give this one a slight pass for not covering all of American history, but it's okay. I want to talk about Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington by James Kerchick. I read this when we did our LGBTQIA nonfiction special reading roundtable, and it is large, but it is so good. And this one kind of starts along inside the inception of the State Department. So again, we are thinking the State Department's kind of more taking shape within the first couple of presidencies, and how the State Department and our foreign diplomats, our foreign service, was a place where a lot of, in particular, gay men would go to work because people wouldn't ask them as many questions about, like, why don't you have a family? Well, I travel all the time for work, right? And how that has actually been a history of our State Department and our foreign service going forward into our history. And it tells about, again, the secret city, gay Washington, starting within those first couple of presidential administrations and moving forward in time to the present, to see how Washington, D.C., the city, has evolved as a place of belonging and also not for the LGBTQIA community. Again, primarily most of the stories here are going to be gay men. You will get some lesbian stories, but just by the nature of government work for most of our history and what women weren't allowed to do, you know, that's kind of how it comes out. But despite being an extremely large book, it is really narratively compelling, and as someone who's read a lot of presidential history, I found it really interesting to read about various administrations and people who worked in these administrations, and the stories that I knew and the stories that I didn't, or the people that I knew and what I didn't know about them, right? Because there's so much erasure of all of this history. It's why also like Ned Blackhawk's books and Ibram X. Kendi's books are important. We often erase these minority histories out of the official story. And wow, was this a really incredible book for me to like compare and contrast what I had read in like an official biography of a president versus what I hadn't. Speaking of learning about the president, there is an incredible book called The Hardest Job in the World, The American Presidency by John Dickerson. Now, this is a book that is going to bring you through all of our presidents, from George Washington to, I don't exactly remember when this book was published, maybe the first Trump administration, I'm not sure. That's honestly not really the point though. The point is less about the men who occupied the office and more about the evolution of the office itself, and thinking about what we thought the presidency was, what it could do, what we wanted it to do when George Washington was elected versus today, who we probably wouldn't have elected who was our president back then, you know, because they would never be elected today because what we think of with the presidency has changed and how elections happen have changed. And details like the fact that for most of the presidency, it was considered just like impossible that a president would go to, say, a site of a natural disaster, right? I mean, there's a story about how Reagan, something happened during the Reagan administration, and he was like, well, I can't possibly go out there, right? As opposed to today, where if a natural disaster happens or something, we assume the president is gonna head out there. And that's like such a new thing that we probably don't really think of. So this book really puts into perspective how the presidency has changed in a not so large book, very concise narrative, and really, really interesting, that just helps us think about how we have changed as a nation since our first president. And finally, I'm going to end with what is one of the best constructed history books I have ever read, and that is How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States by Daniel Immerwahr. Now, there's a lot of discussions. Is the United States an empire? Well, we fought against empire, but are we an empire? And basically Daniel Immerwahr is saying, yes, we are an empire. And I was like, this is interesting. It doesn't cover the full 250 years because the book opens during the presidency of Millard Fillmore. And Millard Fillmore is annexing these islands and claiming them for the United States because he wants their bird guano. And if you're me and you're sitting there starting this book about empire and you're reading about bird poop, you might be very confused. And I was like, this book is strange. This is a book that, if you give it the chance, has this spiral or staircase to the narrative where this thing that seems ridiculous, like why am I learning about Millard Fillmore and how he needed bird guano for fertilizer, going to come back and be super duper important to our possessions during World War II. And it's going to. And like the chapters, the way that he works through the history, the stories, the way that he weaves them together just helps you see like this bigger picture that is just really incredible. And I'm never not impressed when I go back to this book on how he managed to, because like history, right, is supposed to be a narrative. You go from point A to point B, and yes, he's moving forward in history the whole time, but it builds on itself so well. And it's so well written, it's so engaging, I love it. And again, you learn about things like the physical taking of land for America, right? For what is essentially imperial, that's not right, imperial possessions. Like, for example, we still have territories in the United States, like Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, but also like the power of empire and how we've used that. So in the sense of, for example, the power that America wielded after World War II that went into the decisions that we decided, the global threading for screws and this global idea of what stop signs would look like, right? And so that's not, we didn't own the places that then made screws like this or have their stop signs like this. Those weren't our imperial possessions, but it is kind of exercising a very similar power. And it's so interesting. It's such a good book. It's such an engaging book. It's one of those history books that the history is just like connected so well together that once you realize what he's doing, it's almost impossible to stop reading because you want to know how this story is going to build into the next story and put together this whole view of the greater United States for you. So as I said in my revolutionary video, is this exhaustive? No. I am a product of what I read mostly for my PhD and just for my own interest. So for example, like I said, that's a lot of African American history and Native American history. So for example, there's no Asian American history on this list. If you have recommendations, please leave that down below. But it's just an area that I know as one example of the many, many places that are not covered in this video specifically. But I do hope that within it there are some books, at least one that you're interested in at least trying to, again, broaden that view of the last 250 plus years of history. Because what is incredible about all of these books is that for the most part, they're covering the history of the same years, but they're doing it from incredibly diverse perspectives and reminding us about just the multiplicity of human experiences throughout the history of this country, plus the history of this continent, and more if we go out into those books that have a more global view. So again, this list is not exhaustive. They're just some of my favorites that I'm hoping will interest even those who don't want like a super scholastic book. But I'm very excited to share these with you. Again, if you have recommendations for me, leave them down in the comments. But otherwise, happy reading, happy 250th, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, guys. Bye.